Please, I beg you, have mercy.
The Alpha King's heartbeat thundered beneath Lyra's cheek as she jolted awake, her hands splayed across his bare chest, but his eyes remained closed, his breathing too controlled for true sleep. Panic shot through her like ice water. This wasn't the servants' quarters. The silk sheets beneath her fingertips, the rich mahogany scent filling her nostrils, the sheer size of the bed, she was in the royal chambers. And she was touching the Alpha King. Lyra's breath hitched as she tried to lift her head without waking him. King Darius' black moon lay beneath her, his dark hair tousled against ivory pillows, his scarred chest rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed far too measured. She'd heard the stories whispered in the kitchens, how he'd killed challengers with his bare hands, how his amber eyes could freeze a wolf mid-shift, how no Omega had ever shared his bed and lived to speak of it. How did I get here? The last thing she remembered was scrubbing the marble floors of the East Wing, her knees raw and her back aching as she prepared for tonight's Blood Moon Festival. The other servants had been rushing around in a frenzy, hanging crimson banners and polishing silver until it gleamed. She'd been working for 16 hours straight, surviving on nothing but stale bread and determination. She must have collapsed. Must have crawled into what she thought was an empty servant's bed to rest for just a moment. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Now she was going to die for it. Lyra began to ease herself away from the king's warm body, moving with the careful precision she'd learned from years of avoiding notice. Her hand was still pressed against his chest, and she could feel his heart beating far too fast for someone truly asleep. The realization made her freeze. He's awake. King Darius's breathing remained steady, his features composed in sleep, but that racing pulse betrayed him. Lyra's Omega instinct screamed at her to submit, to bare her throat and beg for mercy. Instead, she found herself studying his face in the dim light filtering through heavy curtains. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps only a few years older than her own 22. Dark stubble shadowed his sharp jawline, and there was something almost beautiful about the way his lashes cast shadows on his high cheekbones. But it was the scar cutting across his left temple that caught her attention, and the fresh wound on his forearm that made her heart clench with unexpected concern. The cut was shallow but angry-looking, probably from training. It needed cleaning. What am I doing? Lyra thought desperately. I should be running. But her healer's instincts, inherited from her grandmother, wouldn't let her ignore an untreated wound. Moving as carefully as possible, she reached for the water pitcher on the nightstand. Her fingers trembled as she dampened the edge of her worn apron. I'm sorry, she whispered, barely breathing the words. I know I shouldn't be here. I know touching you could mean my death. But this might get infected if it's not cleaned. She dabbed gently at the wound, cleaning away the dried blood with movements so light they were barely touches. King Darius's pulse hammered against her other palm, still pressed to his chest, but he didn't stir. She found herself holding her breath as she worked, terrified of waking him and equally terrified of what would happen when she stopped touching him. There was something wrong with her, she realized. She should be afraid, and she was, but underneath the fear was something else. Something warm and pulling that made her want to smooth the worry lines from his brow, to trace the scar on his temple and ask how he'd gotten it. Omega instincts, she told herself firmly. Nothing more. But she'd been around plenty of alphas in her 5 years at the castle, and none of them had ever made her feel like this. Like she was coming alive for the first time. When the wound was clean, she tore a strip from her apron and bound it carefully around his arm. Her fingers lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, memorizing the feel of his skin, the strength in his forearm. There, she whispered. That's better. She began to pull away, but King Darius's free hand shot out faster than lightning, wrapping around her wrist. His eyes snapped open, and Lyra found herself staring into molten amber that seemed to see straight through her soul. Going somewhere, little Omega? His voice was rough with sleep and something else, something that made heat pool low in her belly. But it was his scent that nearly undid her, pine and winter storms and something wild that called to every Omega instinct she possessed. I'm sorry, Your Majesty, she stammered, trying to pull away. His grip was gentle but unbreakable. I didn't mean to, I was cleaning, and I must have collapsed, and I thought this was the servants' quarters, and your arm was bleeding, and I... Breathe, he commanded softly. She obeyed without thinking, drawing in a shaky breath that was full of his scent. His eyes never left her face, studying her with an intensity that made her feel naked despite being fully clothed in her simple gray dress. What's your name? Lyra Thorne, Your Majesty. I work in the kitchens, Anne, and I clean the floors. How long have you been in my bed, Lyra? Heat flooded her cheeks. I don't know. I didn't mean to, please, I'll leave right now and never speak of this. I swear on my grandmother's grave, I won't tell anyone that I was here. Something flickered in his amber eyes. And why wouldn't you tell anyone? The question confused her. Because you'd kill me? And probably anyone I told? He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb stroking across the pulse point on her wrist with a gentleness that contradicted every story she'd heard about his cruelty. You bandaged my wound. It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. Why? It needed tending, she said simply. Infections can be dangerous, even for alphas. You could have stolen from me. Slit my throat while I slept. Seduced me for political gain. His voice was thoughtful, curious. Instead, you played healer. I'm not a thief or an assassin, Lyra said, finally finding some strength in her voice. And I certainly don't know anything about politics. I couldn't leave you hurt. King Darius sat up slowly, and she realized just how massive he was. Even sitting, he towered over her, his shoulders broad enough to block out the world. But instead of using his size to intimidate her, he released her wrist and reached for a silk robe draped over a nearby chair. You should go, he said quietly. Before someone sees you leaving my chambers. Lyra scrambled off the bed, her legs shaky beneath her. She'd made it halfway to the door when his voice stopped her. Lyra. She turned back, hand on the door handle. Be careful walking alone at night. The blood moon makes some wolves unstable. There was something in his tone that made her think he wasn't talking about random pack members. But she only nodded and slipped out into the darkened hallway, her heart still racing. As she hurried through the castle's winding corridors, Lyra pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm her breathing. She could still feel the phantom weight of his hand on her wrist, could still smell pine and storms on her skin. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known as she disappeared into the servants' quarters, was that King Darius Black Moon sat alone in his vast chamber, staring at the spot where she'd lain beside him. Her scent clung to his sheets like morning mist, wild roses and rain and something indefinably sweet that made his wolf pace restlessly beneath his skin. For the first time in his 26 years, the Alpha King found himself wanting something he couldn't simply take. And that terrified him more than any enemy ever could. Chapter 2. The morning sun cast long shadows through the kitchen windows as Lyra scrubbed pots with mechanical precision, her mind still trapped in the memory of amber eyes and gentle hands. 3 days had passed since her forbidden encounter with King Darius, and she'd barely slept, jumping at every footstep, every raised voice echoing through the castle corridors. She'd expected guards to drag her from her pallet in the servants' quarters. Expected public execution or private torture. Instead, there had been nothing but an oppressive sense of being watched that made her skin crawl and her wolf whimper with unease. Lyra. Cook's sharp voice cut through her thoughts. Stop daydreaming and help Marta with the breakfast trays. The king wants his meals served in the blue parlor today, not his chambers. Her hands stilled on the copper pot. The king never took meals anywhere but his private dining room or chambers. Why the sudden change? Did he say why? She asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Cook shrugged, already moving on to bark orders at the bread bakers. Not for servants to question. Just do as you're told. Lyra exchanged glances with Marta, a fellow Omega who'd worked at the castle for 8 years. The older woman's brown eyes held the same wariness that had been growing among all the Omega servants lately. Strange things happening, Marta murmured as they loaded silver trays with fresh bread, honey cakes, and the king's preferred black coffee. Guards asking questions about Omega servants. Checking our quarters at odd hours. What kind of questions? Names. How long we've been here. Whether we can read. Marta's voice dropped lower. Sarah in the laundry says they're making lists. Ice formed in Lyra's stomach. Lists meant organization. Organization meant purpose. And she had a terrible suspicion she knew what that purpose might be. They made their way through the castle's winding corridors, silver trays balanced carefully in their hands. The blue parlor was in the east wing, a smaller, more intimate space where the king occasionally met with trusted advisors. Lyra had cleaned it countless times but never while it was occupied. As they approached the ornate double doors, she heard voices from within, the king's deep baritone and another voice she didn't recognize, lighter but carrying an edge of authority. The arrangements should be finalized within the fortnight, the unknown voice was saying. My Alpha's patience grows thin. Alpha Cornelius will have his answer when I'm ready to give it, came King Darius's reply, cool and controlled. Not before. Lyra and Marta exchanged glances. Marriage negotiations. The whispers had been growing stronger over the past weeks about potential alliances, about the king finally choosing a mate to secure the realm's future. They knocked softly and entered at the king's command. The blue parlor was awash in morning light, its walls lined with books and ancient maps. King Darius sat behind an elegant desk, every inch the powerful ruler in his black shirt and leather vest. Across from him sat a man Lyra didn't recognize, younger, with perfectly styled blonde hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. Your Majesty, Marta murmured, placing her tray on the sideboard with practiced efficiency. Lyra followed suit, keeping her eyes downcast as she'd been trained. But she could feel the weight of attention on her, heavy as a physical touch. When she risked a glance upward, she found King Darius watching her with an intensity that made her pulse skip. That will be all, he said, his voice carefully neutral. They curtsied and turned to leave, but the unknown man's voice stopped them. Actually, Your Majesty, if I might. The blonde man rose from his chair with predatory grace. I couldn't help but notice the variety of your staff. Lyra's blood turned to ice. She kept walking, but slowly, straining to hear. Meaning? King Darius's tone had gone dangerously quiet. Omegas. The word was spoken with subtle distaste. In my Alpha's territory, we've found it cleaner to limit Omega servants to essential functions only. Breeding stock and wet nurses, primarily. It prevents complications. Complications. You understand, Your Majesty. Omegas are naturally weak, emotional, prone to hysteria. They're easily corrupted, easily turned. Better to maintain a more controlled environment. Lyra's hand tightened on the door handle. Behind her, she could hear Marta's sharp intake of breath. I see. King Darius's voice revealed nothing of his thoughts. And you recommend this approach? For the sake of security, yes. Especially with marriage negotiations pending. A future queen shouldn't have to worry about lesser influences in her new home. Lyra's wolf snarled inside her chest, but she forced herself to keep moving. They slipped out of the parlor and didn't speak until they were safely back in the kitchens. Did you hear that? Marta whispered, her face pale. Lyra nodded, her mind racing. Marriage negotiations. A future queen who wouldn't want Omega servants around. And guards asking questions, making lists. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed made her sick. Over the next 2 days, Lyra tried to make herself invisible. She volunteered for the most menial tasks, worked in the darkest corners of the castle, and spoke to no one unless absolutely necessary. But invisibility, she discovered, was impossible when someone was actively looking for you. She was scrubbing the floor of the portrait gallery when she heard footsteps approaching, measured, confident, unmistakably masculine. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She kept her head down and continued working, hoping whoever it was would pass by. The footsteps stopped directly beside her. You missed a spot. Lyra's hand froze on her scrub brush. She knew that voice, had heard it in her dreams for 3 nights running. Slowly, she looked up to find King Darius standing over her, dressed casually in dark pants and a white shirt that made his amber eyes seem to glow. "Your Majesty," she breathed, scrambling to her feet and dropping into a curtsy. "At ease." He gestured to the paintings lining the walls. "Tell me, do you know the history of these portraits?" The question caught her off guard. Some of them, Your Majesty. My grandmother used to tell stories about the old kings and queens." "Your grandmother was a storyteller?" "She was a healer, Your Majesty. But she believed that knowing the past helped us understand the present." Lyra bit her lip, realizing she'd said too much. King Darius moved to stand before a portrait of a stern-faced woman in elaborate robes. Queen Isabella the Bold. She ruled for 30 years and never married. The court pressured her constantly to take a mate, but she refused to be controlled by political necessity. Lyra found herself drawn into the conversation despite her fear. What happened to her? She died in her sleep at age 75, having expanded the kingdom's borders and established trade routes that still exist today. His amber eyes found hers. History remembers her as one of our greatest rulers, despite, or perhaps because of, her refusal to conform to expectations. There was something in his tone that made her think he wasn't just talking about ancient queens. She was brave, Lyra said quietly. Or foolish, depending on your perspective. He moved to the next portrait, and she found herself walking alongside him, her cleaning supplies forgotten. "Tell me, Lyra, what do you think makes someone truly powerful?" The question was a trap, it had to be. But looking at his face, she saw only genuine curiosity. I think true power comes from protecting those who can't protect themselves. From making choices based on what's right, not what's easy. Even when those choices come with a price? Especially then. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. In the afternoon light streaming through tall windows, she could see flecks of gold in his amber eyes, could smell that intoxicating scent of pine and winter storms that made her wolf purr with contentment. "You're not what I expected," he said softly. "I'm sorry to disappoint, Your Majesty. You misunderstand me." His hand lifted as if to touch her face, then dropped back to his side. "You don't disappoint at all." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching voices echoed down the corridor. King Darius stepped back, his expression smoothing into royal neutrality. "Finish your work," he said formally, then strode away without looking back. Lyra stood frozen in place until the voices faded, then sank back to her knees with shaking legs. What was happening to her? Why did she feel more alive in the king's presence than she ever had before? And why did every encounter leave her wanting more? The pattern continued over the following days. She'd be working in the gardens, and he'd appear to inspect the roses. She'd be delivering linens to the guest quarters, and he'd emerge from a nearby room with some excuse about checking security. Each encounter was brief, seemingly accidental, but they left her increasingly certain that King Darius Black Moon was hunting her. The question was why. Meanwhile, whispers grew louder among the Omega servants. 2 had been transferred to other duties without explanation. Another had simply vanished overnight, her belongings cleared from her quarters with no word of where she'd gone. Their cleaning house, Sarah from the laundry confided one evening as they shared a meager dinner in the servants' hall. Getting rid of anyone who might cause problems for the new queen. What new queen? Lyra asked, though she suspected she knew. Alpha Cornelius's daughter. The negotiations are almost complete. Sarah's voice dropped to barely a whisper. But there's something else. I heard 2 guards talking. They're not just transferring Omegas, they're planning something bigger. What do you mean? I mean some of us might not survive the transition. The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. She'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach churn with fear and rage. That night, she couldn't sleep. She paced her tiny quarters, her mind spinning with possibilities. She could run, slip away in the darkness and try to make it to another pack's territory. But she had no money, no connections, and winter was coming. She'd likely die before reaching safety. She could try to warn the other Omegas, but what could they do? They were powerless against the political machinery grinding toward an inevitable conclusion. Or she could. The thought was so dangerous she almost dismissed it immediately. But it lingered, growing stronger with each passing moment. She could fight. Not with claws and teeth, she'd never win that way. But she was smarter than most people gave her credit for. She could read and write, thanks to her grandmother's insistence on education. She knew the castle's layout better than most of the guards. And she had something else, something that might matter more than physical strength. She had the attention of the Alpha King. The next morning brought news that made her decision for her. Marta was gone, her quarters stripped bare, no explanation given. Cook claimed she'd been transferred to the outer territories, but the fear in his eyes suggested otherwise. Lyra was arranging flowers in the main hall when she overheard a conversation that confirmed her worst suspicions. By the end of the week, a male voice was saying, "The Alpha wants the palace cleaned before his daughter arrives." All of them? This was a different voice, younger, uncertain. Every Omega servant. Some will be relocated, others, disposed of. Can't have them spreading their weakness to the new queen. But what about the ones with useful skills? The healers, the replaceable. Alpha Cornelius is bringing his own staff. Stronger stock, better breeding. Lyra's hands shook as she continued arranging the white roses, her heart hammering against her ribs. They weren't just being transferred, they were being eliminated. Systematically removed like weeds from a garden. She had to find a way to warn the others. Had to find a way to stop this before. Beautiful work. She spun around to find King Darius standing behind her, his amber eyes unreadable. He was dressed formally today, in the black and silver that marked official royal business. "Thank you, Your Majesty." She curtsied, her mind racing. Did he know? Was he part of the plan? "Walk with me," he said, and it wasn't a request. They moved through the corridors in silence, past tapestries and portraits that had watched over the kingdom for centuries. Finally, he led her to a small alcove overlooking the gardens, private and secluded. "You've heard the rumors," he said without preamble. Her throat went dry. "Your Majesty, I..." "Don't lie to me, Lyra." His voice was quiet but firm. "You're many things, but you're not a fool." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze despite her fear. "Yes. I've heard them. And what do you intend to do about it?" The question caught her off guard. She'd expected accusations, threats, maybe even immediate punishment. Not, whatever this was. "I don't understand." "You're in danger. All the Omega servants are. What do you plan to do to protect yourself?" Was this a test? A trap? Or was the Alpha King actually concerned for her safety? "I plan to survive," she said finally. "Whatever that takes." Something flickered in his amber eyes, approval, perhaps, or recognition. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have." Her voice grew stronger, fueled by desperation and a strange sense that honesty was her only weapon. "I'm an Omega servant, Your Majesty. I have no power, no influence, no resources. But I'm not going to die quietly while someone cleans house for political convenience. Even if fighting means certain death? Better to die standing than live kneeling." The words came out more forcefully than she'd intended, echoing in the small space between them. For a moment, she thought she'd gone too far, that her defiance had finally pushed him past his mysterious patience. Instead, King Darius smiled. It was a small thing, barely more than a curve of his lips, but it transformed his entire face. For just an instant, he looked less like an untouchable ruler and more like a man who'd found something he'd been searching for. "Good," he said softly. "That's what I hoped you'd say." Before she could ask what he meant, footsteps echoed from the main corridor. King Darius's expression smoothed back into royal neutrality, and he stepped away from her with practiced ease. "Think carefully about your next moves, Lyra," he said formally, his voice carrying just far enough for the approaching guards to hear. "The choices you make in the coming days will determine your future." He strode away without another word, leaving her alone in the alcove with more questions than answers. But one thing had become crystal clear as she watched him disappear around the corner. She wasn't just being hunted by the king for punishment or sport. King Darius Black Moon was testing her, evaluating her, preparing her for something she didn't yet understand. And somehow, that terrified her more than the thought of execution ever could. The sound of approaching voices made her shrink back into the shadows. 2 guards passed by, their conversation low but audible. "Confirmed for tomorrow night. All Omega servants are to report to the East Wing after midnight." "What's the official reason?" "Relocation. But we both know what that means." "The king approved this?" "The king's been distracted lately. Alpha Cornelius has been very persuasive about security concerns." As their voices faded, Lyra pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her mind reeling. Tomorrow night. They had until tomorrow night. She wasn't just being hunted by the king anymore. Someone wanted all Omegas gone, and they were using the marriage negotiations as cover for what amounted to systematic extermination. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Chapter 3. The great dining hall blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames dancing off crystal goblets and polished silver. Lyra had never seen the castle so magnificent, or so dangerous. Every table groaned under the weight of roasted meats, honeyed fruits, and elaborate pastries, while visiting alphas from across the realm mingled with King Darius's court in a carefully orchestrated display of power and diplomacy. She moved through the shadows along the walls, refilling wine pitchers with mechanical precision while her heart hammered against her ribs. Tomorrow night's deadline loomed over her like an executioner's blade, but tonight she had to focus on surviving this feast without drawing attention to herself. "More wine for table 7, Cook hissed, thrusting a heavy silver pitcher into her hands. "And keep your eyes down. Half the alphas in the kingdom are here tonight." Lyra nodded, adjusting her grip on the pitcher. The wine was a special vintage from the royal cellars, reserved for only the most important occasions. Its deep red color caught the candlelight like liquid rubies, beautiful and enticing. As she wove between the tables, she caught fragments of conversation, trade agreements, territorial disputes, marriage negotiations. At the high table, King Darius sat in his ceremonial black and gold, every inch the powerful ruler. To his right sat Alpha Cornelius, the blonde man she'd seen in the blue parlor, his pale eyes constantly scanning the room. To the king's left was Prince Marcus, Darius's younger brother, whose dark hair and amber eyes marked him as royal blood, though his features held a cruel cast that made her skin crawl. "The Omega situation must be resolved before any formal agreements," Alpha Cornelius was saying, his voice carrying over the general din. "My daughter cannot be expected to rule alongside inferior stock." Prince Marcus nodded eagerly. "Father always said Omegas were a weakness the kingdom couldn't afford. Their emotions make them unreliable, their nature makes them manipulative." "Enough." King Darius's voice cut across his brother's words like a blade. "This is neither the time nor the place for such discussions." Lyra hurried past before she could hear more, but the prince's words echoed in her mind. "Father always said." She'd heard whispers about the late king's views on Omegas, how he believed they diluted the pack's strength, how he'd wanted to limit their numbers but had been overruled by his queen. It seemed Prince Marcus had inherited more than just his father's looks. She was refilling goblets at a table of minor lords when she noticed something that made her blood turn to ice. The Omega servants, herself included, were pouring from different pitchers than the ones used for Alpha and Beta guests. The wine looked identical, but the silver pitchers bore different markings, subtle engravings that would be meaningless to anyone not trained to notice such details. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, "Always watch the details, little wolf. Poison often wears a beautiful face." Lyra's hand stilled on a goblet, her enhanced Omega senses suddenly picking up something wrong with the wine scent. Beneath the rich aroma of grapes and oak was something else, bitter, acrid, familiar from her grandmother's warnings about toxic plants. Wolfsbane extract. Deadly to all wolves, but especially devastating to omegas, whose smaller size and different metabolism made them more vulnerable. Her heart stopped. The wine being served to omega servants and guests was poisoned. She glanced around the hall with new eyes, noting which servers were omega, which guests. Not many, omegas were rare among the nobility, but enough. If they drank the poisoned wine, they would collapse within minutes, their deaths appearing natural to anyone who didn't know what to look for. And in the chaos that followed, with omegas dying at a feast hosted by King Darius, suspicion would naturally fall on the visiting alphas. Alpha Cornelius had been vocal about his disdain for omegas. What better way to start a war than to make it look like he'd acted on his prejudices? But who would benefit from war between the kingdoms? Who had access to the royal wine cellars and the knowledge to execute such a plan? Her eyes found Prince Marcus at the high table, watching the proceedings with barely concealed satisfaction. As she watched, he raised his goblet, filled with the pure wine, in a toast. To new alliances and the strength they bring, he declared, his voice carrying across the hall. Around the room, guests raised their goblets in response. Lyra watched in horror as several omega servants, caught up in the moment, lifted their own cups to their lips. She had seconds to act. No. The word tore from her throat as she dropped her pitcher, sending silver and wine crashing to the stone floor. Don't drink the wine. The hall fell silent, every eye turning to her. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical force, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. King Darius rose slowly from his throne-like chair, his amber eyes locking onto hers with laser intensity. Explain yourself, he commanded, his voice deadly quiet. Lyra's legs shook, but she forced herself to speak. The wine, Your Majesty. The wine being served to omegas, it's been poisoned. A murmur ran through the crowd, part shock, part disbelief. Alpha Cornelius surged to his feet, his face flushed with outrage. This is preposterous. Are you suggesting that one of us? I'm suggesting someone wants it to look that way, Lyra interrupted, her fear giving way to desperate courage. Wolfsbane extract in wine would kill omegas quickly but leave little trace. The deaths would appear natural, but the timing, during a feast with visiting alphas who've made their disdain for omegas clear, would suggest foreign involvement. King Darius descended from the dais with predatory grace, his eyes never leaving her face. You're accusing someone of attempted murder and warmongering. I'm trying to prevent both, Your Majesty. And how, he said, stopping directly in front of her, does a kitchen servant know about wolfsbane toxicology? The question hung in the air like a blade. Around them, she could feel the crowd's attention sharpening, waiting for her answer. The truth would expose her grandmother's illegal healing practices, but lies would cost lives. My grandmother was a healer, she said, lifting her chin. She taught me to recognize poisons and their effects. Healers are forbidden to practice without royal sanction, Prince Marcus interjected, his voice sharp with accusation. Are you admitting to harboring a criminal? I'm admitting to having knowledge that could save lives, Lyra shot back, then turned back to the king. Test the wine, Your Majesty. Compare what the omegas are drinking to what everyone else has been served. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, King Darius studied her face. She could see him weighing her words, calculating risks, measuring her sincerity against the potential consequences of being wrong. Beta James, he called without taking his eyes off her. Bring the wine for testing. Both varieties. Your Majesty, surely you don't intend to, Prince Marcus began. I intend to determine the truth. The king's voice cut through his brother's protest like steel. Immediately. Beta James, a grizzled older wolf who served as the court's chief investigator, moved swiftly to collect samples from both sets of pitchers. He disappeared through a side door, returning minutes later with a grim expression. Wolfsbane, Your Majesty. Concentrated extract in the wine designated for omega service. Enough to kill within minutes of consumption. The hall erupted in shocked voices, but Lyra barely heard them. She was watching Prince Marcus, seeing the way his jaw tightened, the way his hand clenched on his goblet. When his eyes met hers across the chaos, she saw pure hatred burning there. "Secure the wine stores," King Darius commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. "I want every bottle tested, every access point guarded. Beta James, begin questioning everyone with access to." He never finished the sentence. At a table near the back of the hall, a young Omega servant suddenly gasped, her face going pale as she swayed on her feet. She'd already drunk from her cup before Lyra's warning. "Help her." Lyra didn't wait for permission, pushing through the crowd toward the collapsing woman. "I need hot water, honey, and milk thistle if you have it." "You will do no such thing," Prince Marcus snarled, blocking her path. "You're a servant, not a healer. Step aside and let the proper physicians." "She'll be dead by the time they arrive," Lyra snapped, her fear transforming into fierce determination. "The poison is already in her system. Every second counts." King Darius appeared beside his brother, his presence like a thunderstorm given form. "Let her through." "Darius, you cannot seriously be considering." "I'm considering saving a life." The king's amber eyes blazed with authority. "Stand aside, Marcus." Prince Marcus's face darkened with fury, but he stepped back. Lyra rushed to the collapsed Omega, dropping to her knees beside the woman's convulsing form. "What's her name?" she asked, checking the woman's pulse, rapid and thready, her skin already showing the gray pallor of wolfsbane poisoning. "Elena," someone whispered. "Elena, listen to my voice," Lyra said, cradling the woman's head. "You're going to be all right, but I need you to try to stay conscious." She looked up at the crowd of worried faces surrounding them. "Honey and warm milk, now. And if anyone has charcoal powder, bring it immediately." As servants scattered to fulfill her requests, Lyra began the delicate process of treating wolfsbane poisoning, something her grandmother had taught her years ago, though she prayed she'd never need to use the knowledge. "The honey will bind some of the toxins," she explained, more for King Darius than anyone else, as she carefully dripped the golden liquid between Elena's lips. "Milk helps buffer the stomach acid that makes the poison more potent. Charcoal absorbs what's left." "How do you know this will work?" King Darius asked, his voice low and intent. "Because my grandmother saved 3 pack members this way when I was 12, Lyra replied, supporting Elena's head as the woman struggled to swallow. "A rival pack tried to poison our water supply with wolfsbane. Grandmother recognized the symptoms and acted quickly." "Your grandmother treated multiple poisoning victims?" "She saved their lives." Lyra's hands never stopped moving, administering treatment with practiced efficiency. The pack leaders wanted to execute her for practicing without sanction, but the families she'd saved protected her. Around them, the great hall had fallen silent except for Elena's labored breathing. Lyra could feel dozens of eyes watching her every move, judging, evaluating, waiting to see if her unconventional knowledge would prove salvation or merely delay the inevitable. Gradually, Elena's breathing steadied. Color began to return to her cheeks, and her convulsions eased. When her eyes finally fluttered open, focusing on Lyra's face with growing clarity, a collective sigh of relief rippled through the watching crowd. "Thank you," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. Lyra helped her sit up slowly, checking her pulse again. "Stronger now, more regular. You're going to be fine. The worst is over." She became aware of the silence surrounding them, of the weight of attention focused on her small form kneeling on the cold stone floor. When she looked up, she found King Darius watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, surprise, respect, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. "Remarkable," he said softly. "Your grandmother taught you well." "She taught me that knowledge is only valuable if you're willing to use it to help others," Lyra replied, climbing to her feet on unsteady legs. "Even when using it puts you at risk?" The question held layers of meaning she was only beginning to understand. "Especially then, Your Majesty." King Darius stepped closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "We need to talk. Privately." Before she could respond, Prince Marcus's voice cut across the hall like a whip crack. How convenient that our heroic servant girl just happened to know about the poison. How perfectly timed that she discovered it just before anyone died. His amber eyes glittered with malice. One might wonder if she had advanced knowledge of the plot. The accusation hit Lyra like a physical blow. Around them, she could see doubt creeping into faces that had moments before held gratitude and respect. "You're suggesting I poisoned the wine myself?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I'm suggesting this entire incident is suspiciously convenient for someone looking to gain favor with the king," Prince Marcus replied smoothly. "Create a crisis, solve the crisis, earn a reward. That's enough." King Darius's voice carried the full weight of royal authority. "Your accusations are baseless, Anne." "Are they?" Prince Marcus turned to face his brother, his expression earnest and concerned. "Think, Darius. She admits to illegal healing knowledge. She had access to the wine stores. She knew exactly how to treat the poisoning, almost as if she'd prepared for it." Lyra felt the crowd's mood shifting, suspicion replacing gratitude like storm clouds swallowing sunlight. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but Prince Marcus wasn't finished. "And let's not forget her unprecedented access to you recently. How many private conversations have you had with this Omega servant? How many opportunities has she had to study your habits, your preferences, your vulnerabilities?" The word struck home with devastating accuracy. Lyra saw King Darius's expression tighten, saw doubt flicker in his amber eyes. Of course their encounters would seem suspicious to outside observers. Of course her knowledge and timing would raise questions. "Your Majesty," she began, but Prince Marcus cut her off. "I propose we settle this matter properly. Let the Omega drink from the poisoned wine herself. If she's innocent, she should be confident in her ability to treat the symptoms." The suggestion sent ice through Lyra's veins. She'd saved Elena because she'd caught the poisoning early, before the toxins had time to fully take hold. Deliberately consuming wolfsbane extract would be far more dangerous, possibly fatal even with immediate treatment. "That's barbaric," Beta James protested. "Trial by ordeal went out with the Dark Ages." "Then let her submit to proper questioning under truth magic," Prince Marcus countered. "If she has nothing to hide, she has nothing to prove." King Darius stepped between his brother and Lyra, his body language radiating protective authority. "The wine was tested and found poisoned, exactly as she claimed. She saved a life tonight, not endangered one. So you choose to trust an Omega servant over your own brother's concerns for your safety?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, laden with implications that went far beyond this single incident. Lyra could see the trap closing around them both. Prince Marcus had maneuvered the conversation to make King Darius's defense of her look like weakness, like an alpha compromised by Omega manipulation. "I choose to trust evidence over paranoia," King Darius replied coldly. "The investigation will continue, but tonight's events speak for themselves." Prince Marcus's expression darkened with barely concealed fury. "Of course, brother. Your wisdom is, as always, unquestionable." The words were respectful, but the tone carried poison more deadly than any wolfsbane. As the prince turned and stalked from the hall, his supporters trailing after him, Lyra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Clear the hall," King Darius commanded. "The feast is over." As nobles and servants began filing out, murmuring among themselves, the king turned to Lyra. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of responsibility that never left his shoulders. "That was well done," he said quietly. "You saved Elena's life. I did what anyone with the knowledge would do." "No," he said, his voice certain. "You did what someone with courage and compassion would do. There's a difference." The unexpected praise made heat rise in her cheeks. "Your Majesty," about what Prince Marcus said. Marcus sees threats where none exist and dismisses real dangers for the sake of politics. King Darius stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his intoxicating scent of pine and winter storms. "Tell me, Lyra, when we've encountered each other these past days, did you believe I was truly asleep during our first meeting?" The question caught her completely off guard. what do you mean? I mean I've been awake for every moment we've spent together. Every conversation, every test, every carefully orchestrated encounter. His amber eyes held hers captive. I've been watching everyone around me, measuring their reactions, their loyalty, their true nature. Including yours. The revelation hit her like lightning. All those coincidental meetings, the way he'd appeared wherever she was working, the pointed conversations and meaningful glances, none of it had been chance. You've been testing me, she whispered. I've been testing everyone. His hand lifted to cup her face, thumb tracing across her cheek with devastating gentleness. The difference is, you're the only one who passed. Before she could process what that meant, chaos erupted from the corridor outside. Shouts echoed through the castle, followed by the sound of running feet and clashing steel. Your Majesty. Beta James burst through the doors, his face grim. We've found the source of the poison. Prince Marcus has barricaded himself in the East Wing with a dozen supporters. He's claiming the right of challenge for the throne. King Darius's hand dropped from Lyra's face, his expression shifting from tender to lethal in an instant. On what grounds? He says you've been compromised by Omega influence. That your judgment is clouded by unnatural attachments. Beta James's eyes flicked to Lyra, his meaning clear. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. The poisoned wine, the accusations, the public display of King Darius defending her, it had all been orchestrated to create this moment. Prince Marcus hadn't just wanted the Omegas dead. He'd wanted to use their deaths to destroy his brother's reign and claim the throne for himself. And somehow, Lyra had become the key to his entire plan. Chapter 4. The dungeon air hung thick with the scent of damp stone and despair as King Darius descended the spiral staircase, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed centuries of royal justice. Behind him, Beta James and 4 guards maintained respectful distance, their hands resting on sword hilts. Lyra followed silently, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd insisted on coming despite Darius's protests, claiming her healer's knowledge might be needed if Marcus had been injured during his capture. The truth was far more complex. She needed to see the man who tried to murder innocents with her own eyes, needed to understand the depth of hatred that could drive a brother to such extremes. Prince Marcus sat in the largest cell, his royal finery torn and stained but his amber eyes still burning with unrepentant fury. Even shackled, he radiated the dangerous charisma that had won him followers, the cruel intelligence that had nearly destroyed the kingdom. Brother, he said as Darius approached the bars, his voice mockingly warm. Come to gloat over your victory? I've come for answers, Darius replied, his tone carefully controlled. The poison, the coup attempt, why? Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Why? Look around you, Darius. Look at what our great kingdom has become under your enlightened rule. His gaze flicked to Lyra, standing in the shadows. Omegas advising kings, servants making policy, weakness masquerading as compassion. Elena nearly died because of your poison. Elena was expendable. They all are. Marcus rose from his stone bench with fluid grace, moving to the bars. Father understood that strength comes from purity, from keeping the bloodlines clean and the hierarchy intact. But you've let sentiment make you weak. Darius stepped closer to the cell, and Lyra could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control he maintained over his wolf. Strength comes from protecting those who serve loyally, not from murdering them for political convenience. Does it? Marcus's smile turned predatory. Tell me, brother, what exactly is the nature of your protection over that particular Omega? The question hung in the air like a blade, sharp with implication. Lyra felt ice form in her stomach as Marcus's gaze found her in the shadows. I saw her leaving your chambers, you know, the prince continued conversationally. The night of the blood moon. Disheveled, carrying your scent, looking thoroughly satisfied. You're mistaken, Darius said, but there was a dangerous edge to his voice now. Am I? How fascinating that a mere servant would have such intimate access to the Alpha King's private chambers. How convenient that she just happened to discover my wine plot before it could succeed. Marcus's voice dropped to a silky purr. Tell me, Darius, how long has the Omega been warming your bed? How long has she been whispering poison in your ear, turning you against your own blood? That's enough. The command cracked like a whip, but Marcus only smiled wider. The court is already talking, you know. Servants gossip, nobles speculate. They're wondering how an Omega maid gained such influence over their king. They're asking whether the great Darius Black Moon has been compromised by a clever seductress. Lyra pressed back against the stone wall, wishing she could disappear entirely. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the dungeon, Beta James's surprise, the guard's speculation, Darius's carefully controlled fury. You will retract those accusations, Darius said, his voice deadly quiet. Will I? And what will you give me in return? My freedom? The throne that should have been mine from the beginning? Marcus laughed again. Or perhaps you'll simply execute me to protect your Omega's reputation. That would certainly prove my point about weakness ruling the kingdom. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Lyra could hear her own heartbeat, could smell the complex mix of emotions radiating from everyone present, anger, fear, confusion, and underneath it all, a terrible uncertainty. Beta James, Darius said finally, his voice carefully neutral. Escort the prisoner to more secure quarters. I want double guards on his cell at all times. Of course, Your Majesty. As the guards moved to transfer Marcus, the prince caught sight of Lyra again. Enjoy your elevation while it lasts, little Omega. Kings tire of their toys eventually, and when they do. He drew one shackled finger across his throat in a gesture that needed no translation. The procession moved deeper into the dungeons, leaving Darius and Lyra alone in the flickering torchlight. For a long moment, neither spoke, the weight of Marcus's accusations hanging between them like a physical presence. We need to discuss what happens next, Darius said finally, not meeting her eyes. Your Majesty. The court will demand answers. Marcus's supporters will use his claims to undermine my authority, to question every decision I make. He began pacing, his movements sharp with frustration. They'll say I've been compromised, that I can't be trusted to rule objectively. Each word hit Lyra like a physical blow. She'd known this moment would come, had dreaded it even as she'd dared to hope. What? That somehow their impossible situation could have a different ending? What do you need me to do? She asked quietly. He stopped pacing, finally turning to face her. In the torchlight, his amber eyes seemed to burn with inner fire. Nothing. You'll do nothing because you're under my protection now. Your protection? Tomorrow, I'll address the court. I'll make it clear that you're a valuable asset to the kingdom, someone with rare healing knowledge that proved crucial in saving lives. I'll explain that your access to the royal quarters was necessary for consultation purposes. Asset, asterisk, the word hit her like a slap. After everything they'd shared, every moment of connection and understanding, he saw her as property to be protected, not as a person who mattered. I see, she managed, proud that her voice remained steady. You'll be given quarters in the East Wing, away from the servants' areas. A position as an official court healer, with appropriate compensation and status. He was speaking faster now, as if trying to convince himself as much as her. It will explain our interactions, provide a reasonable justification for your presence. And what about the truth? The question stopped him cold. What about it? What about the fact that I didn't seduce you or bewitch you or manipulate you for political gain? What about the fact that whatever has happened between us was real, not calculated? Her voice grew stronger with each word. What about the fact that calling me an asset makes everything we've shared sound like a business transaction? Lyra. He stepped toward her, hand outstretched, but she moved away. No. I understand perfectly, Your Majesty. You need to protect your throne, your reputation, your political future. I'm just grateful to be a valuable asset in that equation. The hurt in her voice seemed to physically pain him. She could see him struggling, could smell the conflict radiating from his skin, desire warring with duty, heart fighting political necessity. That's not what I meant, he said finally. You know that's not what you are to me. Do I? Because right now, all I know is that I'm something that needs to be managed, controlled, explained away. She lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. Thank you for your protection, Your Majesty. I'm sure your court will find your explanation satisfactory. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Where are you going? To pack my belongings. I'm sure my new quarters won't require much. Assets don't need many personal possessions. Lyra, please. Good night, Your Majesty. She walked away without looking back, her spine straight and her head high. Only when she was safely out of sight did she allow the tears to fall. By dawn, Lyra had made her decision. She sat on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, her few possessions packed in a cloth bundle beside her. The castle was beginning to stir. She could hear the early kitchen staff starting their preparations, the guards changing shifts, the familiar sounds of a world that had never truly belonged to her anyway. She would leave. Slip away during the morning chaos, before King Darius could address the court, before she became an official asset in his political maneuvering. She had some coin saved, enough to buy passage with a merchant caravan heading south. There were pacts beyond the kingdom's borders that might take in a healer, especially one with her grandmother's knowledge. It would mean abandoning the other Omega servants to their uncertain fate, but what could she do for them now? Her presence had only made things worse, had given Marcus the weapon he needed to attack his brother's rule. The kindest thing she could do for everyone was disappear. She was reaching for her bundle when footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, too many footsteps, moving too quietly for normal morning activity. Lyra froze, her enhanced senses picking up scents that didn't belong in the servants' quarters, leather, steel, and the particular musk that marked Marcus's supporters. Through her door's thin crack, she glimpsed figures moving past, men she recognized from the previous night's feast, nobles who had supported the prince's coup attempt. But they should have been arrested, imprisoned with their leader. What were they doing free and armed in the castle? Unless they were never really imprisoned at all, asterisk. The thought sent ice through her veins. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear their whispered conversation as they passed. Passages lead directly to the dungeon level. We can have him out within the hour. And the guards? Taken care of. The night shift won't be reporting for duty. Horror flooded through her as the implications became clear. Marcus's supporters hadn't been imprisoned, they'd been playing a deeper game, one that involved betrayal from within the royal guard itself. They were going to free the prince, and from the sound of it, they'd already eliminated the guards who might stop them. She should run. Should grab her bundle and flee the castle before the coup could succeed. But even as the thought formed, she found herself moving toward her small window, peering out at the courtyard below. Dawn was breaking over the castle walls, painting the stones gold and crimson. Somewhere in those towers, King Darius was preparing to address his court, unaware that his brother's supporters were moving freely through his stronghold. Unaware that the man he'd captured was about to escape to finish what he'd started. She thought of Marcus's words in the dungeon, his threats and implications. If he escaped now, he wouldn't just challenge for the throne, he'd paint her as a seductress who had corrupted the king, who had weakened the realm through Omega manipulation. Her presence in Darius's chambers that first night would become proof of her scheming, evidence of a conspiracy that existed only in Marcus's twisted imagination. Darius would be painted as weak, compromised, unfit to rule. The kingdom would tear itself apart in civil war, and in the chaos, other alphas like Cornelius would move to claim territory and power. All because she had collapsed from exhaustion and crawled into the wrong bed. But it wasn't the wrong bed, asterisk, a voice whispered in her mind. It was exactly where you were meant to be. She closed her eyes, remembering the feel of Darius's heartbeat beneath her palm, the gentleness in his touch, the way he'd looked at her after she'd saved Elena's life. Whatever he'd called her in front of the court, whatever political necessities had driven his words, she knew what lay beneath them. Just as she knew what she had to do now. Her bundle lay forgotten on the cot as she slipped from her quarters, moving through the castle's back corridors with the stealth her grandmother had taught her. She knew these passages better than most, Years of cleaning had given her intimate knowledge of every hidden door, every servant stair, every route that avoided the main thoroughfares. She made her way toward the dungeons, following the path Marcus's supporters had taken. If she could find evidence of their conspiracy, proof of their betrayal, she might be able to warn Darius before it was too late. The deeper levels of the castle were different in daylight, shadows pooled in different places, familiar spaces took on alien shapes. She moved carefully, pausing at each corner to listen for voices, for the sound of movement that might betray hostile presence. She found the evidence she sought in a storage room near the main dungeon entrance. Maps spread across a wooden table showed detailed layouts of the castle, with guard positions marked and patrol routes highlighted. But it was the documents beneath the maps that made her blood run cold. Letters. Dozens of them, written in Marcus's familiar hand and bearing the seal of Alpha Cornelius. The correspondence painted a picture of conspiracy that went far beyond a simple coup attempt. They were planning to divide the kingdom between them, with Marcus ruling as a puppet king while Cornelius controlled the eastern territories. The Omega problem will be resolved permanently once you take the throne, one letter read. My daughter expects a clean court, free of such distractions. The purge should be swift and thorough. Another detailed the planned massacre, blame the poisoning deaths on foreign agents, then use the chaos to eliminate all Omega servants as potential security risks. The people will support necessary measures to protect the realm. The final letter was dated only 2 days ago. If the initial plan fails, implement the contingency. My forces will be in position at the border, ready to provide assistance in restoring order to a kingdom in chaos. Lyra's hands shook as she read the casual planning of genocide, the cold calculation behind what would have been the murder of every Omega in the kingdom. She folded the letters carefully, tucking them into her dress. This was the evidence Darius needed, proof of the conspiracy that... Well. What have we here? She spun around to find 2 of Marcus's supporters blocking the doorway, their hands resting on sword hilts. Both were men she recognized from court, minor nobles with cruel smiles and ambitious hearts. Lord Garrett. Lord Vance. She kept her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. I was just discovering things you shouldn't know about, Lord Garrett finished, stepping into the room. How unfortunate. For you, Lord Vance added with a laugh. Though I suppose we should thank you. Prince Marcus has been wondering how to properly frame his brother's indiscretions. Having the Omega whore caught spying will make the story much more convincing. They moved toward her with predatory confidence, clearly expecting an easy capture. They hadn't counted on her grandmother's training, or the desperate strength that came from fighting for survival. Lyra feinted left, then dove right, rolling beneath the table as Lord Garrett lunged for her. She came up near the room's second entrance, the letters still clutched in her hand. Stop her. Vance shouted, but she was already running. The dungeon corridors became a maze of terror as she fled, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the stone floor. Behind her, she could hear pursuit, heavier footsteps, shouts, the ring of steel as swords were drawn. She reached the main dungeon level just as she heard another sound that chilled her blood, the grate of metal on metal as a cell door swung open. My prince, a voice called. This way. We have horses waiting. Excellent. Marcus's voice carried clearly down the corridor, warm with satisfaction. And my dear brother? Addressing the court as planned. He has no idea. Perfect. By the time he realizes what's happening, we'll be at the border with Cornelius's forces. The kingdom will be ours by sunset. Lyra pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering as the escape party moved past her hiding place. Marcus walked free, surrounded by armed supporters, his chains gone and his royal bearing restored. In the torchlight, his smile was the most terrifying thing she'd ever seen. When their footsteps faded, she found herself alone in the dungeon depths, clutching evidence of treason while the architect of that treason moved freely toward his final victory. Above her, Darius was preparing to address a court that included traitors and conspirators, unaware that his brother was already free and moving to claim the throne. She could still run. Could slip out of the castle and the chaos that would follow, taking the letters as insurance for her own safety. She could find passage south, disappear into anonymity, let the kingdom tear itself apart without her. But the memory of Darius's touch haunted her, the way he'd looked at her after she'd saved Elena, the gentleness he'd shown despite the political pressures crushing down on him. He might have called her an asset, might have chosen duty over honest feeling, but she knew the man beneath the crown. And that man was about to walk into a trap that would destroy him and everything he'd tried to protect. Lyra closed her eyes, taking one last moment to imagine the life she might have had if she chose differently. Freedom, safety, a chance at happiness somewhere far from the intrigues of kings and courts. Then she opened them and began running toward the throne room, toward the man who'd seen her as valuable enough to protect, toward a choice that would define not just her fate but the future of everyone she'd ever cared about. Behind her, the empty dungeon echoed with the sound of her footsteps, marking the rhythm of a decision that would change everything. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe, like and share this video to be the first to get notified when the part 2 of this story drops.